Good evening, everyone, and welcome to BT's Fly Tying Friday. Tonight, Dick Rohrbaugh is taking us on a fishing adventure in the Madison River country, and we'll touch on a couple of tips in the weekly area on wiggle flies. More on that later. But for now, I'm Al Beatty, and my lovely wife, Gretchen, is right over there. She's tying flies. Decided to do that and let me run the IT today. Dick Rohr retired from a 35-year college teaching degree that was at Lewis and Clark College in Portland, Oregon, and is now able to spend more time pursuing fly fishing and tying. Both have been a passion of his since he was a kid fishing the wonderful streams of western Montana. The world-famous Dan Bailey was a mentor and family friend. Dick has taken those long ago learned skills and passed them on to others via teaching, demonstrating at various clubs and shows, and even done a bit of guiding as a charity contribution for Trout Unlimited. He tells us, quote, "We winter in Oregon, but live half of each year in our log home on the Madison River, not far from the West Fork, where fly fishing is as good as it gets," unquote. I couldn't agree more. Tonight, Dick will introduce us to the secrets of Hebgen Lake, the Madison River, and the Calabadis mayfly.
Yeah, so tonight, what I want to do is tie what we might call the life cycle of the Calabadis. What I want to do today is tell you a little about the fishery. We'll tie the flies for the Calabadis hatch that occurs here. It can begin even in late June, but it doesn't really get going great until late July. It's all of August and part of September. And it occurs every day at about 9:30 in the morning and lasts till the wind comes up. While the hatch is going, you will see more rising fish than you'll see anywhere in the world. The fish here are called gulpers. And they call them that because you can actually hear them. And you can see them all around you. You don't have an occasional rise. You might have 20 rises right around you. So you have targets all morning long. And what I want to do today is show you something of the life cycle of the Calabadis. The fish feed on all three stages: on the nymph, on the dun, and on the spinner. We're going to tie those, and then at the end of the program, I want to show you how I fish them. And we're going to learn a little about fishing for gulpers. These are very special fish. I've been fishing this lake for 40 years, and I've only caught one fish under 17 inches. That actually happened this last summer. I caught one about 12. But most of the fish are 18 to 26 inches. And they're both browns and rainbows. And every summer I catch a fair number of 20-inch fish. So we're going to talk about the life cycle of the Calabadis. Up in the right-hand corner there, you can see the picture of the Calabadis dun. They are a very healthy size 14 in the early weeks of the hatch. And then gradually, as it goes on, they begin to get smaller and smaller. If the hatch lasts into September, by then the fish will, or the bugs will be size 18. So we have to be prepared to tie all three stages of this fly in several sizes. The first one I'm going to tie is a fly I created to imitate the Calabadis nymph. I call it the sun dancer. And in the middle of this screen there, you can see the Calabadis nymph. It's got a fairly stout body, 6 legs and 3 tails, though I think fish are a little numerically challenged, so numbers don't matter. Well, what I'm interested in is the picture on the right. And there you can see one that has just reached the surface and it's getting ready to hatch. But you can see right near the top of the nymph, near the head, there's a light area that's actually a little bubble. And that's something we want to imitate, because what we're trying to imitate is the nymph just as it's beginning to emerge in that particular stage. So the hooks that I listed here, Tiemco 200R works well. It's a 3X long, Daiichi 1270. WR is the Cabela's nomenclature for their hooks. And in a 14-16, as I say, it can go to 18. Actually, I'm not going to be tying on any of these tonight. I'm going to be tying on a Daiichi 1730. And when I show you the hook, you'll understand why. We're going to be using tan or gray thread, 8/0. I'm using unithread tonight. The tail will be pheasant tail. You could use brown partridge fibers. And the abdomen will be pheasant tail fibers wrapped, counter wrapped with copper wire. For the thorax, which is fairly hefty, you can see it better here in the emerger. For the thorax, we're going to use natural ostrich, and we're going to wrap it just the way you would a hackle. We got to have legs on this critter, and we're going to use pheasant tail fibers for that. And then in order to create this bubble on the back of the emerging nymph, we're going to use holographic mylar, and we're going to cover that with UV clear to create a bubble on the top. And I'll show you how we do that as we go along. So here's a look at the materials. Here's the UV clear, got copper wire, got holographic mylar, got a pheasant tail. We need to make a comment about pheasant tail. When you go to your fly shop and you buy a clump of pheasant tail, the one you want to use for this particular fly is the center feather. The reason for that is the fibers on the center feather are much longer than they are on the side feathers of the clump. So we're going to use the center feather from the pheasant tail. I'm going to be using tan 8/0 unithread, and as I said, I'm going to be using this is the fly when it's finished. Here you can see the Daiichi 1730, and one of the things that I like about that hook, you can see the shape of the shank here. It's got a kind of a crook in the middle of it, and so we got a high spot right here. And that's going to help us with the proportions on this fly. And I like this hook because I can make use of that. So the first thing I'm going to do, obviously, is just tie on. And I'm going to wrap back about to that hump in the hook. There, I'm going to tie in gold wire. This is very fine gold wire. We don't need anything heavy. But I'm going to tie it in and wrap it along my side of the hook. I don't want it on top. Would work fine on the bottom. But I'm going to tie it onto my side of the hook, and I'm going to wrap it back till I'm right just about above the point of the hook. Now here's my center feather from a pheasant tail. And you can notice how long these fibers are. That's what I'm after, because we're going to make both the tail and the body out of one clump of these. And I want 4 or 5 of these fibers. So I'm going to tie it on right here at the back. That's a little longer than I want, a little bit shorter. You know, the usual wisdom is make the tail about the length of the shank. This is a 3X long shank, and the tails of a Calabadis are not that long. So I've just tied it in, and now I'm going to move my thread up to that hump in the hook. And I'm going to wrap the pheasant tail. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. It's just like tying a pheasant tail nymph at this point. So we'll work our way up to the hump of the hook where we'll end the abdomen. Tie that off, get rid of the excess. If you cut with your scissors, don't use the tips if you're cutting wire. The next thing I want to put on is the holographic tinsel. And notice that when you pull it off the spool, it's always got a big curve in it. It's helpful to keep that curve on the down, pointing down as you tie this in. And the reason for that is this so that it doesn't get in the way of everything else. You want to be kind of careful here and make sure that that holographic tinsel is right on top. When we've got that in, I'm going to bring the thread forward just about to the eye of the hook. We want to put some legs on this critter. And I've got another pheasant tail feather here. This is one of the side feathers. The fibers are not near as long. I don't need long ones for this, so I make use of these feathers for legs. What you want to do is pull them out to the side like this so you get all of them the same length. Chop them off, and you're going to need more than you think. What we're going to do is kind of make sure you've got all of those about the same length. And I'm going to tie them on right here. I'm going to roll those kind of back up on top and cut off the excess. So by having this curving down, it's not in my way at the moment, which is helpful. The next material is this natural ostrich curl, just natural color. It's kind of a grayish brown. And I usually take about 3 fibers of this. Move my thread back to the front. Then I'm going to wrap these just the way you would wrap hackle. This is going to create a little bulkier thorax for us. Whoops. You want to be sure you don't come too far forward, because if you do, you're going to crowd the head. Tie those off. At this point, I usually do a little barbering. What I want to do is I want to cut the ostrich fibers off the top. And you're going to see why in a few minutes. But I'll get that so can you see that? Yeah, I've trimmed it down toward the hook shank on that side. Next thing I want to do is bring these legs back. So I'll grab about half of them, pull them back on one side. And then I usually find to bring this ones on this side back, it helps to rotate the vise a little. Get it into position where I can wrap those so I've got about half the fibers on each side. Finally, we'll bring the holographic tinsel over the top and wrap ourselves a head. And I'm going to be using this UV clear. So what I'm going to do is put a bubble of this stuff right over top of that holographic tinsel. And so there's the sun dancer nymph. This is probably a fly that's a little more familiar to most of you. Popularized by Craig Matthews. Standard dry fly hook. I said here 14 and 16, though at the end of the season, the Calabadis will be down to size 18, and they are very picky about size. That's a 1 extra fine, 1 extra long. And I like the length of the fly. I think it matches the size of the Calabadis a little bit better. So that'll be our hook. I'm going to use tan thread. Tonight I'm using unit thread. The shuck, and note that this is not a tail. So this shuck will be gray or tan Zelon. You could use Antron. The body is a tan dubbing, and the wing is deer hair. Deer hair from the flank area of a white-tailed deer. But getting the right hair is everything for success in tying this particular fly. Up in the corner, you see there the dubbing that I'll be using. It's super fine. I'll be using a kind of a tannish gray dubbing. 8/0 thread again, a Zelon that I'm using for the shuck. So you need to think a lot about the deer hair you get to tie this fly. I tried to make a little chart here. What you're looking for are not the three kinds of deer hair that are on the left. The first one is too thin. And the problem with that is that it won't flare enough. The second one may be the right diameter of hair, but look at that long black tip that's on the end of it. That's the kind of hair you get certainly on the back of a deer. It's not useful for this kind of a fly. That black tip really doesn't work very well. The third one in on the right is way too big a diameter. That's the kind of hollow hair that you would use for spinning. It also has long tips on it, and it's not what we're after. What we want is hair of a small but not too thin diameter with very, very short tips. And as I say, it comes nicely from the flank of a white-tailed deer. But I'm trying a little experiment here tonight. I'm actually going to tie it tonight with coastal deer hair. Out here on the West Coast, we have a species of deer that I don't think exists elsewhere in the country, coastal black-tailed deer. Their hair is relatively fine in diameter. It flares just about the right amount. And the coastal deer don't grow as heavy an underfur coat in the winter as Rocky Mountain deer do where it's much colder. But it actually works quite well. So I'll start wrapping on just as you normally would. And I'll show you a little tip that I picked up from John Kreft, who I think is tying. So what I've done is I've laid down a layer of thread to about the middle of the hook. And then John very helpfully pointed out, if you then go back halfway in that area that you covered with thread, you're going to be at about the right place to tie in the wing. That's a very helpful little tip. So here you can see I've got a stack of the coastal deer. And one of the things I'd hasten to say to everybody is almost everybody, when they're learning to tie this fly, uses way too much hair. But when I put it on, I'm going to, on my side of the hook, lean it down at an angle this way, because as I begin to wrap it, it's going to roll the hair up onto the top of the shank, and it's going to begin to flare. Do not let go of the butts of the hair. Get in here with your scissors and cut it off at an angle. Now I'm going to come back here and put in the shuck. This is a strand of Zelon. It is not a full strand. I've pulled about a third of the strand out. A full strand of Zelon is too heavy. What I'm going to do is try to lay this in here and make it transition with it between the body and the shuck. Come back here and I cut this off just a little bit shorter than this long hook shank. I can just put it on the thread. It's a little unsanitary, but I wet my fingers if I need to. I want to wrap a relatively thin body, and I'm going to work my way forward here till I get to where that lump is. Then I'm going to go back and forth and begin to build a taper. I'm going to leave the body right now. I don't want to finish it quite yet. I want to come up here and get my thread right at the base of that hair. And what I'm going to do is pull a little bit of it back and cinch it down, pull a little bit more and cinch it down, a little bit more and cinch it down. And now I can pull the rest of it. Oops. What I want to do is hold the wing back, and I want to wrap one good tight wrap of that dubbing right in front of that wing. Now I'll come back and finish this and make it into a nice taper. Then I can come back and whip finish. If not, we'll go to the spinner. Calabadis spinners absolutely carpet the water. When they first begin to appear, fish don't take them. But there will be a point in the hatch when all of a sudden they will stop taking duns and they will take only spinners. And to fish this hatch successfully, you need to know how to recognize when that switch occurs and when you then have to switch the pattern that you are fishing. The other thing that's interesting to me is most of you have seen spinner patterns. You know, a rusty spinner is an example. And they are tied with the wing flat the way this natural looks in the picture. The fish will really not take a Calabadis dun tied that way. What we need to do is tie it so it looks like the picture of the fly you have there with the wing halfway down. One of the things that does is it lets the body float a little bit lower in the water. And for some reason, they will take that deer hair spinner with the half down wing when they will not take a spinner that's laying absolutely flat on the water. So what I'm going to do is show you how to tie this deer hair spinner. And it's not difficult to tie, and it ties. So we're going to use, I'm again going to be using a 50-12. It's a little longer hook. Primarily 14 and 16, but in September 18. A divided tail, and I'll show you a little about that material when I get to it. So once again, I'm going to use the John Kreft trick. Go about halfway down the shank. One of the things I can use are microfivots, and I'm sure you've all seen these. I don't do that anymore. I now have a lifetime supply from this. So if you want microfivots, that's a quick, easy way to get a supply of them. I want to tie them right on top of the hook, and it's very important that they be right on top, not off to either side. And I'm going to wrap it back to about the hook point. Obviously, those are too long. Some people get anal about it and want to have the fine ends of that sticking out. I don't care. I'm going to cut them. But I want to show you a little trick here for splitting them. It works very nicely. I'm using red thread just so you can see it. But I'm going to take a length of thread, wrap it around the back of the hook. I want to bring that up between the fibers and pull it up toward the hook. And I want you to watch what happens. As I pull on that, whoops, I overdid it. As I pull on it, the tail fibers will split. Then I can just wrap it down, and those aren't going anywhere. I get a nicely stacked batch of hair. And then I'll come up here and get halfway up toward the front and tie these on. Again, leaning them down. Wrap myself a good sturdy flat platform. Cut these off at an angle. I'm going to do the same thing here with the body that I did with the sparkle done. I'm going to wrap the back half of it, but not all the way up to the wing. Again, I want to, even if you have to go layer it back and forth, you'll get much better bodies if you create a thin noodle rather than a thick one. Start working my way forward. Then I'll build right here a little for that taper. I'm going to leave that much of the body, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to stand this wing up the same way I did the other one. Wrap them down in front. Then I got one that doesn't want to cooperate there. Then what I want to do is I want to split these in half. You could use a double needle to split these. I'm going to split the batch in half one way, figure 8 the other way. And I always find to wrap this one, it helps if I kind of lean it down toward me with the vise. Come around. Got one wild hair to get rid of. And there I have a nicely split wing. Now, when I split wings like this, I always put a little dab of cement right there. And I'm going to come back here and start creating a better looking body. Then I'm going to figure 8 around the wings. We'll whip finish. And our little deer wing spinner will be done. So there we have a spinner. Got a nicely split tail. The wings are split apart. And they're about halfway down so that it'll lay nicely on the water that way. We're going back to Hebgen Lake. So I want to talk about the equipment that I use to fish and the way I fish it. I use only a floating line. I don't want the nymph sinking deep. I use a 12 to 15 foot leader. And that surprises a lot of people, but there is a reason for it. The reason you don't catch little fish during the Calabadis hatch in Hebgen Lake is because the little fish don't go. They're afraid of the eagles and the ospreys, so they won't cruise near the surface. The big fish cruise near the surface. And hence they're very leader shy. So when I'm fishing the nymph, I use a 12 to 15 foot leader, usually 5X with the nymph. And this one is absolutely critical. You cannot have your leader floating on the surface. If you do, you're simply out of business. You often see people when they're fishing near the surface or on the surface, their leader is kind of curled and floating on the surface and it sparkles in the sun. If you do that on Hebgen, you're not going to catch anything. So I usually use a monofilament leader with a fluorocarbon tippet, but on the monofilament leader, I put leader sync on it so that it stays beneath the surface. And I want these nymphs just an inch or two under, no more than that. And I want to try to imitate the behavior of a Calabadis nymph. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen them. They hatch in the weed beds that are all over Hebgen Lake. And when they're hatching, they rise out of the weed bed right near it. And what the fish tend to do is circle round and round the weed beds, picking these things off. But little Calabadis nymphs swim, they're real swimmers. They look like a little minnow swimming in the water. So it's 2 rapid pulls of about a foot. let it sit. 2 rapid pulls of about a foot, and let it sit. This is not fishing the way you would a chironomid with a very, very slow retrieve. These are rapid little critters when they swim, and you want to pick them off just below the surface, and I'll show you more about that in a minute. Now, when I go to dries, again, a floating line, again, a 12 to 15 foot leader. Over the years, I've discovered pretty convincingly that I'll get more hits if I go to 6X. Again, the leader cannot be floating on the surface. The problem with 6X is trying to land 22, 24-inch fish on 6X is a challenge. You won't get as many hits on 5, but you'll keep more fish. Now, when you're fishing the dry, I'm going to show you this graphically in a slide in a minute, but you're going to try to throw that dry 4 to 8 feet in front of a moving fish. I'll show you why when we get to the slides. But one thing that is true, both of the nymph and the dry, is you cannot false cast over top of these fish. They will see your line flashing in the air and they're gone. So you have to do your false casting off to the side, and then you get one shot. It has to be accurately placed 4 to 8 feet in front of the fish in its direct line of travel. So we're going to talk in a minute about how do you know which the direct line of travel is of these fish. And you have to do it in a way that does not put any flashing line or leader in the air over top of the fish. So let's go back to Hebgen Lake and figure out how we're going to do this. For many years, I fished in a float tube. They're okay. You can get closer to the fish, but you can't move around. And one of the things that you find on Calabadis hatches is the fish tend to travel in schools. You can be sitting in your float tube a quarter mile from a school and you just sit and watch. I can move around much more quickly in a pontoon boat, and this is the way I've fished for years. I now have a motorboat that I can use. It requires much longer casts. With a pontoon boat, I can get within 30 feet of the rising fish, let's say. You're 50 to 60 feet with the motorboat. So you got to be able to throw a long cast accurately, quickly, with no false casting over the fish. But that's the name of the game. So now I want you to look very closely at this slide. This is Hebgen Lake. And you can see two things here that are important. First, do you see out in the middle of the lake, do you see the weed bed? That's a weed bed that produces Calabadis. There's actually several of these little weed beds here. I actually took this picture from my pontoon boat, and I had my pontoon boat sitting in the middle of a weed bed. The reason for that is the fish just go round and round and round the weed beds. That means I can pick them off as they're coming by. And it happened, this fish, there's another one farther out, but these fish are just working between the two weed beds, the one I'm in and the one you can see. Now look very, very closely at this rise. A lot of fishermen think that a rise form is round. It is not. It's oblong. And the ripple on one side of that rise is much higher than the other side. Can you see that on the left-hand side of this ripple, it's barely visible? On the right-hand side of the rise, you have a very visible ripple that's higher. The higher ripple is the head of the fish. The low ripple is the tail of the fish. So I could tell that this fish was angling toward me. And the question now becomes, was that fish taking the nymph an inch or two under the water, or was it taking a dry? Sometimes you can see them and you'll know, but there's an easier way. When they're taking the nymph, the rise will be caused not by the mouth of the fish, but by its back. And hence you will see no bubble in the center of the rise ring. This particular fish is taking a nymph. So I begin the hatch by fishing the nymph. I'll throw it 4 to 8 feet in front of that because that's about how frequently the fish rise. And you want to put it out there 4 feet, which is where its next gulp is going to be, or 8 feet where the one after that is going to be. How would I know if these fish had switched to dry flies? When they feed on the surface, you will see a bubble in the center of that rise ring. Do you always see a bubble when they're feeding on top? No, but you frequently do. So when I look at the rise forms that are all around me, if I see no bubbles anywhere, I'm fishing the nymph. If I begin to see bubbles, I switch to the dun, because that bubble tells me that the fish, even though they don't make a bubble in every single rise form, the fish have now switched to the dun. How will I know if they have switched to the spinner? Because there will be nymphs, duns, and spinners present on the lake all simultaneously. Well, if I get my fly 4 to 8 feet in this front of this fish, I'm right directly in its line of travel. I've made an accurate cast. I haven't put the fish down, and it ignores it. And that happens 2 or 3 times. Folks, it's time to switch. Usually happens about an hour into the hatch. And for the remainder of the hatch, I don't care how many nymphs and duns are around, they will not take them. They will now switch entirely to the spinner. And the spinner fall will last until the wind comes up, which might be a couple hours. And so I switch finally to the spinner. So that's the end of my pitch. If you ever get the chance to fish this, this is truly one of the premier dry fly fisheries in the entire world. You don't catch a lot of fish. It takes real casting accuracy, but I guarantee you, they're gonna get your attention. The biologists don't know why, but their average size and average number of fish in this lake is growing. The average size used to be 18, now it's nearer to 22. The biggest one I caught last summer was a 26-inch brown. And I actually landed that on 6X. I would have to be honest and say I lose more on 6 than X than I land, but that's sort of the pitch. So, is that clear?
Well, this next section is the weekly tip. And that's all it's going to be as a tip. We won't be tying any additional patterns or anything like that. We'll probably tie patterns that fall into this particular category as we get further along. I don't know, maybe further into the spring or in the fall. But what we're going to talk about is flies that have motion. And yes, I know that a lot of flies have motion based on the materials in them. And we're just going to take one material for the fun of it. You all know what happens when marabou moves through the water, it moves. Well, it can move even more if you do something to the fly to increase the motion, if you will. And that's what we're going to talk about. What I have laying here is the stuff we're going to talk about tonight. I'll set the static guard aside. We don't need it. We're going to be using Loctite super glue. It will already have been done. We're going to start with some discs that you get at the hobby store. They're, I think they're called sequins or something like that. Anyway, you get them at the hobby store, Hobby Lobby, or places like that. We've got some buttons off of a couple of my shirts. We'll talk about that in a little bit here. We're going to leave this last one for a few minutes and put this one in the vise. what we have here, okay, well, they will add lots of motion to your fly. Now here I've got one mounted, and all I did is wrap a lot of thread in behind it. As you can see, let me get my pointer. As you can see right here, and I've glued it so that it's firm. But I want you to notice the angle of the disc. It's tilted back slightly on the bottom and forward on the top. So the top is slightly forward here, right up here. The top is forward and the bottom is slightly back. Well, what that's going to cause this to do is if you give a strip, it's not going to come straight through the water. It's going to cause it to jump up. Just jump a little bit, not much. It's not my favorite way to do it, but it'll cause it to jump. We're going to show you the other setup that we have here with the sequin.
Huh?
Did someone ask a question, Gretchen?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Oh, he said, what a sequence work, and
I would if they don't collapse under the pressure of the
well,
water.
they might collapse.
And I don't know that. You can see here I've added a bead in front, and all that does is it causes it to give just a little bit more erratic motion. Both of these we've found work well if all you have is your standard materials on the hook. We're going to get into the next.
By the way, Sandy says that's called a spacer in the jewelry section.
Oh, spacer in the jewelry section. Anyway, we'll set aside those spacers now that we know what to call them. And we're going to get out the next part of buttons that we have here. There are some buttons with 4 holes in them and some with 2. Now this is one with the button mounted with a bead behind it. I want you to notice that it's also one, it's a 4-holer, and the way we have it situated is the bulk of the button is pointed down below the hook shank, and it's held in place stationary with this bead and glue. This one will really give a jump up when you give it a strip. But also notice that the size of the button is much larger than the spacer. And you're going to really have some trouble with your fly if you don't do something to counteract the force that this larger button creates here. And the way we found the best way to balance it out is a longer tail made out of a movable material like marabou. Marabou and chickaboo is what we do. And the bigger the button, the longer the tail. And what they do then is they counterbalance each other. This one will move up. Now we're going to show you another one. And you notice that the reason it tilts back is because the button has been pushed forward against the down eye. Well, here's another one through the top hole, but we've changed what we've done to it. I'm going to first set it in the vise like this. And you notice it's mostly above, and I've done that on purpose. And I've done that on purpose because what I have done is added 4 strands of 015 weighted wire. We'll just call it lead wire, so that it would cause it to travel through the water column like this. That one wiggles like a flatfish. If any of you have ever done any spin fishing in a Rapala flatfish, that will wiggle just like it, as long as you counterbalance the size of the button up here with the length of the material out behind the tail. Okay, now set all that aside. I'm going to show you right out of our fishing bag of tricks. This is a product that's on the market called Wiggle Fin. I'll give you a close-up when we get over there. It's actually a company here in Boise, but I got into these long before we moved to Boise. And these are they're called Wiggle Fin action discs. And this is what they look like. I'll just hold it with my little clip. And it's a tube. You run your leader through. This sets at the front of the fly and causes it to wiggle like again, like a flatfish. And it's particularly good if you just put it in front of woolly boogers. Well, now here's the trick that I'm taking right out of my fly box. What we do is we mount this in a vise and turn it so we can tie a head on it. Now I know for you dry fly purists and some of the fly fishing purists, you're probably going to just shudder and think Al has gone to the dark side, and he has. He's been on the dark side for a long, long time. But this is a head that we add to a lot of other flies. And when we're trolling a lake out of a canoe or even out of our pontoon boats, you row very slow and this thing will wiggle along behind you. You can't believe the number of fish you'll pick up. And you'll have the fly back here with the leader just running through this. So
I'm
there,
sorry, I didn't understand if that's, where's the back of the fly?
the
Where's
fly,
the eye? Where's the eye of the fly?
the eye of the fly is just like this, except it's a wet fly.
Okay. Okay,
You run the leader through the disc,
got it.
tie it onto the fly, and the woolly bugger or similar works very well, or whatever else. One of my biggest fish in the last couple of years was out of Cascade Lake, and I caught it on a zonker with one of these in front.
Al, this is Jerry.
Yeah.
If you take, you have that sitting there like that, if you drill a hole in one side, about I don't know, not an eighth, but maybe a 3/32 hole, you'll actually make it turn sideways in the water.
That's
And
the way.
the hole will throw out bubbles.
Oh,
Okay, the same thing with the button.
thank you. I was
Okay.
just. Oh boy, I got some new experimenting now to do come summer. Let's go
Yeah.
back to the vise for just a second. And I'll give you a close-up Wigglefin action disc. And the website is wigglefin.com. Real hard to remember. And again, it's probably not what some of the purists want to see, but if you really want to catch some fish and do so on your fly rod, it's kind of a little bit of crossover fishing.